This week in Berlin, an assortment of European ministers gathered for a summit of the Berlin Process, an initiative established a decade ago to maintain the momentum of European Union enlargement in the Western Balkans. On that criteria, it is difficult to adjudge the Berlin Process much of a success. It is more than a decade since any country from the Western Balkans, or indeed anywhere else, was welcomed into the EU. Croatia in 2013. In that time, resentment has swelled among those countries of the Western Balkans still standing in what appears a static queue, and anxiety has grown among outside observers that this inertia might yet agitate the flammable nationalist tendencies still very much at large in the region. Two flashpoints are of particular concern. Republika Srpska, the predominantly ethnically Serbian entity within Bosnia-Herzegovina, the leadership of which is, and with ill-disguised encouragement by Russia, making noises about secession, and Kosovo, now recognised by most of the world as a sovereign state, but which Serbia still insists is a temporarily rogue province. In this special episode of the Foreign Desk, mostly recorded at the recent Globsec forum in Prague, we'll meet people who have contemplated these issues up close. How far from the peace and stability offered by the EU are the Western Balkans now? What is it like trying to clear that path for a living? And is there still a danger that the region could erupt again? This is the Foreign Desk.
In a region where conspiracy theories are very common, we could get out of control if there is not a force to cool it down. This could generate a situation of destabilization with the consequences that people would not see that there is any danger of a big war.
What I would like to see more is support from the society, because there is no quest for normalization in neither of the two societies. They are rather criticized for making progress down the path of normalization. And this is really not helpful. That means there are still people who believe that either you can live with the status quo or you can win and defeat the other party. Neither of the two is realistic, and neither of the two is helpful for Serbia, for Kosovo, and for the Balkans.
My own family, they were all anti-fascist and anti-Nazi, but they were also anti-communist. After Yugoslavia turned out to be a communist country, they all felt duped. It never could work because it was based on the suppression of freedom. So it was just another experiment in a long history. But then that history really burdens the present and becomes a defining moment of the processes.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Muller. The Balkans being a famously straightforward part of the world, we will start by unpacking the latest from the region with Guy Delorny, Monocle's man in the Balkans. I began by asking Guy whether there were general concerns now in the Balkans about the direction of travel.
I think what we've got at the moment is the European Union, with the war in Ukraine, that the last thing it really wants to have happening in the Western Balkans are any of the frozen conflicts that exist here, defrosting in essence, heating up. It doesn't want that to happen. And it doesn't want to give bad actors, and by bad actors, pretty much I mean Russia in all of this, any openings to cause mischief in the Western Balkans, which might distract the European Union and the West in general from what's going on in the Ukraine or even the Middle East. So what they're really trying to do is try and keep things as quiet as they can in the region. The problem is they're not doing a very good job of it.
Let's take a look at a couple of those frozen conflicts, because we will be returning to them later in the show with people who have to deal with them up close. If we look at Bosnia, first of all, which has been a long frozen conflict now, you might say, for nearly 3 decades, are there particular concerns that could get properly unpleasant again?
I don't think anybody's thinking about armed conflict at this moment, but the big issue with Bosnia is simply that it's utterly dysfunctional. So just for example, we've just had a court ruling by the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina overturning an election law that was passed in the Republika Srpska, which is one of the two main entities of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so if you're in Republika Srpska, you're probably going to be an ethnic Serb. If you're in the other entity, the federation, you're more likely to be a Croat or a Bosniak Muslim. Now, Republika Srpska has been going hammer and tongs in recent years under the leadership of its president, Milorad Dodik, passing legislation which, if not secessionist or leading to secession, is certainly provoking people and raising fears and causing the Constitutional Court and the International High Representative to intervene to prevent this legislation undermining the national institutions of Bosnia and Herzegovina. What it's really serving to illustrate is how weak these national institutions are. You know, we're not talking about the centre not being able to hold in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We're talking about the fact that the centre barely exists. And as long as you don't have that, then there's always going to be this ever-present idea that Republika Srpska could break away, that maybe Herzegovina, which is predominantly Croat, could be agitating for a status as a third entity or closer relations, closer ties with Croatia. These are the issues which we're looking at all the time in Bosnia and Herzegovina, largely because the Dayton Peace Agreement, which brought an end to the conflict in 1995, wasn't ever meant to be the final version of the peace, if you like. Things were meant to progress, and they haven't.
I mean, it says much about this part of the world that Kosovo looks like a relatively straightforward diplomatic proposition, certainly when compared to Bosnia, but has any progress been made on that in recent years, or are we still stuck in the same place where Kosovo still wants, complete recognition from the world? It has most of the world recognising it, and Serbia is determined to strew whatever obstacles it can in the path of that process.
I was having a chat with a Western diplomat recently, and we were talking about the issues in the region, and of course Kosovo came up. And this diplomat asked me, well, what do you think should have happened with Kosovo? And I said, well, pass me a time machine and we can go back to 2008 and do things slightly differently. Because the issue is when you make a unilateral declaration of independence, which is what Kosovo did in 2008, that's obviously problematic, not just for Serbia, but for a lot of other countries. And while you've got 5 non-recognisers among the EU member states, while you've got extremely significant countries like Brazil, Indonesia, India, all not recognising Kosovo's independence, never mind the people you expect not to recognise Kosovo's independence, so close allies of Serbia like Russia and China, there's clearly a problem. And Kosovo's got a certain way forward in terms of people recognising it. About half the United Nations member states do. It does not have a seat at the United Nations, however. It has got the ability to compete in the Olympics and the international football competitions, but not the Eurovision Song Contest. All of these things prevent it from feeling properly like an established state. And it's very difficult for it to do so when you consider that the number of non-recognitions which still prevail. And that's not going to change unless Serbia changes its mind about Kosovo. And that's not going to happen while the current governments are in power in both Belgrade and in Pristina, Kosovo's capital, because as President Aleksandar Vučić of Serbia said just earlier this week, that after a meeting in Brussels, which involved all the leaders of the Western Balkans and Ursula von der Leyen, he said currently there is no relationship between the leaders of Serbia and Kosovo. And if you've got no relationship, then there's no chance of anything changing.
Guy, just finally on this, there is optimism, possibly wistful optimism in some quarters, that one thing that might help to sort all this out would be the absorption of the Western Balkans into the European Union, and most of those countries, as you know, have been queuing a very, very long time. The Berlin process, which is supposed to be helping this along, is convening this week for what I guess is its 10th anniversary summit. It is more than those 10 years since the last country joined the EU, which was Croatia. How severe among those non-EU countries in the Western Balkans, those ones still on the other side of the velvet rope, how severe is the resentment at the lack of progress on this?
I think there's a sliding scale. I think the people resent the most probably at the moment are in Serbia, because they were sold the idea of the European Union and that the European Union wanted Serbia and the direction of progress will be towards Brussels. And yet they've seen over the years the European Union show a distinct lack of enthusiasm for bringing Serbia or the other Western Balkan countries in. I mean, after Croatia joined in 2013, they battened down the hatches pretty much. And you've probably heard Edi Rama, the Prime Minister of Albania, more or less laughing when suggested to him that his country could be in the European Union by 2030, for example. And in Serbia now, the number of people who actively want to join the European Union is in the minority. And there's just about as many people who are strongly opposed to Serbia joining the European Union. You get other countries where the support is much higher, like North Macedonia. But then again, we've just seen the election there of Macedonian nationalists in both the presidency and the government. And that's largely because as soon as North Macedonia changed its name to appease Greece and end the decades-long dispute over the very name of the country, Bulgaria pops up with a bilateral dispute of its own over identity and history. And this is stymieing North Macedonia. Until and unless Brussels can bang heads together, drive things through, and show the countries of the Western Balkans that it really means business and it's serious about it, there's always going to be that feeling within the Western Balkans that, never mind on the fast track, we're not really properly on the track at all.
Guy Delorney, thank you for joining us. That was our Balkans correspondent, Guy Delorney. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Muller. At Globsec in Prague, I was joined by Christian Schmidt, the German former minister who has been serving as High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina since 2021, one of whose tasks is keeping the country in one piece. I began by asking the High Representative if he can stop the president of Republika Srpska from holding a referendum on independence.
Yes, a very clear announcement that we will not accept, like it has been in 2014, where it not worked out. But I rely on political understanding of those who want to do this. I feel that the support around Banja Luka is not that high and so convincing that he really wants to jump into this adventure. It will be an adventure, and it will be blocked from my side with help of the international community.
Do you think he doesn't have the numbers for a yes vote?
One could see decisions after they are counted, but I would doubt.
Do you have much contact with Dodik and the Republika Srpska leadership on a day-to-day basis?
On the environment and people in Banja Luka, I am getting the impression that they are getting themselves a little bit confused about what is the plan, where are they going to. Why? Because they see that separation would be a contradiction to fulfill all the expectations which are lying in European Union integration. So it is politically not an easy way to go, where to go with an autonomous independent Republika Srpska, 800,000 population, one of the weakest economies in the region. The consequence, in my understanding, expectations, and what we hear, and sometimes check a little bit, people would leave. Simply living where, I would say, the message would be, if we are not ought to be part of European Union and Republika Srpska, we will individually decide to be members of European Union or citizens of them.
That all being said, is there ever any temptation just to call his bluff and say, all right, you want it, you can have it, off you go?
If it would just concern him and his environment, I would say that's an option. But responsibility to the people and to the citizens does not allow to think about this.
If it is the case that integration into the European Union might solve a lot of these problems for Bosnia, is it difficult to, from your position, to offer that? Because Bosnia obviously does seem a long, long way from that happening.
Yes, we see that the so-called growth plan, which has been offered last year by the European Commission, did so far not work out in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Why? Because the conditionality of European Union about legislation and state of law issues has not been met. So there we are again. I see that we should make clear and make understandable that it is not the delivery of European Union to say, let's come in, what do you want? And this is basically the problem. We have not a political environment and understanding that it is on the responsible groups in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Republika Srpska to contribute by administrative and legal decisions. I know 113 points were requested by European Union, and 111, 110, 112, I don't know exactly, are fulfilled. Some few are remaining, and this is answering the question, do you want a state as member of European Union, or are you on a destructive mode just to try to dissolve the existence of this post-war Dayton Bosnia-Herzegovina?
Dodik has himself more or less said exactly that, though, hasn't he? That he sees his role as kind of a wrecker, that he wants to stop Bosnia from entering the EU. Is the fact of Republika Srpska's presence always going to be an obstacle to that as long as Dodik decides to make it one?
This could be, I think, proved if we go for free and fair, transparent elections, integrity of elections, to check really what people are thinking, coming back to the other question. And I would say it seems that the pressure, which is coming from external sources and own situation on Dodik's environment, is very strong. I noted with interest that after the visit of the director of CIA 2 weeks ago in Sarajevo and then in Belgrade, we heard very, very friendly statement about Dayton from Milorad Dodik. So there seems to be some interest of him to come to a kind of solution. Maybe we will have to discuss about competences of entities, of municipalities or whatever. This is normal, ordinary business, constitutional business. But first it needs, and he has said that he would stick to Dayton and does not want to reorganize the territorial structure of Bosnia-Herzegovina and the neighborhood, because there will be an affection anyhow to the neighborhood.
He does also appear to be at least flirting, though, with coming to a kind of arrangement with other players, i.e. Russia. You will be aware that he's been a repeat visitor to Russia these last couple of years. Last time he turned up at a conference in St. Petersburg, pointedly Republika Srpska was given its own flag, along with other national delegations, which he seemed extremely excited about. Is it apparent to you that Russia is stirring things up in Republika Srpska, perhaps especially since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
I see severely a concern that the impact of Russia, not in, what should I say, reorganizing, but just being destructive and playing and creating some crisis with a minimum of political investment and a maximum of return of investment, that this is the danger. It's not about war, it's about destructive destabilization of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and there is, in our understanding, a severe danger coming from Moscow.
Just to clarify that, you're not so much concerned about any resumption of conflict as we think of it from 30 years ago. It's more the case that for various reasons, including Russian meddling, it's just going to be very hard to make things any better than they are.
In a region where conspiracy theories are very common, it could get out of control if there is not a force, and this is the international force, just to cool it down. I would not see that Dodik has a clear plan to go for segregation, but they're playing with the issue with the help of Moscow. I have to say this very clearly. This could generate a situation of destabilization with the consequences that people would not see that there is any danger of a big war. It would just encourage people more to leave and not to contribute to any battle.
That was Christian Schmidt, High Representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. If there is one envoy anywhere entitled to regard the role of High Representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina as something of an idle swing in a hammock, it is perhaps the EU's Special Representative for Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, responsible as they are for facilitating constructive conversation between Serbia and Kosovo. Also at Globsec, we spoke to the current occupant of this thankless role, former Slovak Foreign Minister Miroslav Lajčák. I began by asking if addressing the Kosovo issue was especially difficult for him as a Slovak, Slovakia having been, like the new nations of the former Yugoslavia, one part of a country which separated during the 1990s, though without much in the way of trouble. I asked him if he ever finds himself thinking, why is Kosovo so much harder?
Well, it is hard because it is hard by itself, but of course then there are particular things. The world admires the way Czechoslovakia split in a friendly way, but obviously when I was appointed High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, there were already headlines saying that I have come to divide the country because that I'm bringing And in this particular case, of course, I come from the country that has not recognized Kosovo. Mm-hmm. So although there is no such thing as collective guilt, this collective guilt is sometimes applied, so that it does not make my life easier, despite the fact that, of course, I have my long history with the issue, and that's why I was asked to do the job. But in these sensitive processes, whatever can be used against you will absolutely always be used.
Just hoping you could give our listeners an insight into what a job like yours actually involves on a day-to-day level. Like, what's something a particular aspect of this job you've been working on in the last week or two?
Well, for the last couple of weeks, the most sensitive issue is the issue of the bridge in Mitrovica and whether it should be open, which the answer is yes. Whether it should be open now, the answer is no, and how it should be open, and that's exactly what we are discussing.
This is the city in the north of Kosovo, which is Serbian on the north bank and Albanian on the south bank.
Yes, and the bridge has a very high symbolic value. In general, this process keeps you really very busy. I have my people on the ground in Kosovo, in Serbia, in Pristina and Belgrade. So we are in daily contacts. We are following everything that is happening there. And then we are preparing the policy recommendations for the High Representative, for the leadership of the European Union, talking to the member states, and basically proposing political actions that might be then taken by different actors, including NATO, for example, or so on. So this is really a dedicated structure that helps the High Representative by doing it for him or for her, that following the developments in the greatest detail and making sure that we are not caught by surprise. And when something happened, then we have advice about steps that need to be taken.
So it's a bridge that's preoccupying you at the moment?
Yes, right now it's the bridge, but it's always more than one issue. So, but there is always something. Yes, I wish implementation of the agreement from Ohrid would be the main issue, but unfortunately, it is yet to come.
It's pretty clear what Kosovo wants. Kosovo wants to be a sovereign, independent country. I know it's recognised, I think, by most of the world by now, but it wants to be a normal, sovereign, independent country. Is it clear to you what Serbia sees as the actual ideal outcome here? Does Serbia, do you think, still entertain ideas of reincorporating Kosovo?
Look, there are different people who are entertaining different ideas, not all of them being rational, realistic, but obviously Serbia knows that without normalizing relations with Kosovo, there will be no progress on the European path. There will be no EU membership. So that means it's pragmatically in their interest. And of course, basically the formula here is, and that's the formula that was already understood and agreed more than 10 years ago, is that Kosovo will give the institutional protection of the Serbian community in Kosovo within Kosovo legal framework, but to preserve their identity, way of life, and the contacts with Serbia according to European standards. There is no special model or special vehicle. And in return for that, Serbia will normalize the relations. As written in the agreement that we reached last year, recognize Kosovo's symbols, documents, institutions, exchange diplomatic missions, not prevents Kosovo's membership in international organizations, and basically all the elements of normal relationship. I'm very careful in choosing words, as you can see, because I have my mandate, and with the signing of the legally binding agreement on normalization of relations. So we are speaking about historical compromise. We are speaking about both sides giving something in order to get something bigger and better.
With all due acknowledgement that you do have to be careful in choosing your words, as any diplomat working in the Balkans has to be, how challenging is it trying to bring all this about when dealing with the two key personalities involved, i.e. Albin Kurti, Prime Minister of Kosovo, and Alexander Vučić, President of Serbia? Albin Kurti, this programme knows quite well, President Vučić less so, but they're not necessarily, I'm guessing, the easiest people to get on the same page?
Well, the personal chemistry between the two leaders, of course, plays a very important role, and I would not reveal a secret saying that this chemistry in this particular case is not great. And I'm being very diplomatic here. At the same time, they are strong leaders. They have a very powerful mandate from their people, so they have the capacity to negotiate and to decide. Yeah, what I would like to see more is like support from the society. Because there is no quest for normalization in neither of the two societies. They are rather criticized for making progress down the path of normalization. So, and this is really not helpful. That means there are still people who believe that either you can live with the status quo or you can win and defeat the other party. Neither of the two is realistic, and neither of the two is helpful for Serbia, for Kosovo, and for the Balkans.
But as long as it remains unresolved, how concerned are you about any sort of return to open conflict? Because there have been, as you know, a couple of incidences in reasonably recent times where one or both sides seem to have walked up to that line and then kind of crept back. But it's not difficult to imagine a scenario in which you end up with a conflict where, well, one of those conflicts which maybe nobody really wanted, but it just sort of starts of its own accord due to some mishap or misjudgment.
I don't see a possibility of a conflict, but there is a potential for violence, for incidents, even deadly incidents. We have seen this in the last 2-3 years, and you are either moving forward or you are moving backward. So also my job has been the phases of normalization and then phases of crisis management, and you cannot speak about normalization when you have a crisis to deal with. So if there will be no progress on normalization, visible progress on normalization, I'm afraid there will be more of these incidents involving people. And as I said, not full-scale conflict, but all this always has a very negative regional impact and beyond.
That was Miroslav Lajčák, former Slovak foreign minister, now EU special representative for Belgrade-Pristina dialogue. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Also at Globsec, I was joined by Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, who served as president of Croatia between 2015 and 2020. I began by asking if she was frustrated at the lack of progress towards EU integration in the rest of the Balkans, given that Croatia was the last country to join the club back in 2013.
Oh, absolutely.
I thought you might say that.
Absolutely, because I've always argued, and a lot of us have always argued, that in order to provide for lasting stability, security, and peace in the whole of the Western Balkans, and I do prefer to call it Southeast Europe because of the connotations of the word Balkans, who wants Balkans in their own house. So the precondition to achieve that lasting peace, stability, security, cooperation is for the whole region, for all the countries to be integrated in the European Union and NATO for those who want so. And even, I was harboring, and I'm still harboring, a desire that at one point in the future, Serbia even might decide to join NATO as well, to be part of that security umbrella.
That might be a tough sell for a couple more generations.
Yes. Although, quite honestly, when I worked for NATO and I would visit Serbia, and I remember very distinctly one of the Belgrade security forums that I attended in my capacity as ASG PDD, so Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy. Journalists ask me, do you think it's counterproductive for Serbia not to be cooperating more closely with NATO and be looking at the goal of NATO membership sometime in the future as a reassurance of Serbia's stability and security as well? And I was pleasantly surprised that I was even asked that question, because even today when you travel to Belgrade, you still see the remnants of the buildings that were bombed during the NATO intervention. So those are physical reminder of this sketchy and difficult history with NATO. But what's important to say is that NATO never attacked Serbia or the Serbian people. It was solely about the regime of Slobodan Milošević and his greater Serbian policies that had caused so much bloodshed in many of the countries, including Kosovo at the time.
I mean, do you have any kind of fears of a return to, well, if not that kind of violence, the violence that preceded the intervention in Kosovo, the wars of the 1990s, that is, if there isn't greater progress towards integration in the EU? Do you still subscribe to the idea that the Balkans, and apologies for using the term, that it is kind of a tinderbox still?
Yes, I will use the term Balkans. I kind of exclude Croatia from that region, Croatia and Slovenia. We always say we are Central Europe and Southeast Europe, so basically connecting different regions. I do have my fears, though. I don't think, and I hopefully I'm not wrong, that we could have the kind of wars that we had in the 90s, because we have achieved some balance of power. At the time, the so-called Yugoslav National Army, which was in the service of Slobodan Milošević, had great military power, and we had nothing in Croatia. We had rifles, hunting rifles, and whatever we could at the time honestly acquire on the black market, because there was an arms embargo, which was very cynical. To introduce an arms embargo on the country that has such huge military assets and using against its own population in the republics who had declared independence. So the whole region has two great potentials. One that we have seen in the past years and decades, and that is the potential to do great things in a relatively short time. If you compare our region to other regions in the world where you have instability or warfare, so we managed to end the wars and rebuild our countries, start the reconciliation process, which is well on the way. However, what's been missing is that full integration into the European Union, which is creating a dangerous vacuum being filled by third actors who are not necessarily benevolent to the region, including the ones who would like to exploit the region to shift the focus of the European Union and NATO elsewhere, for instance, away from Ukraine.
This is Russia particularly you're talking about?
Yes, and some other countries or elements around. It doesn't have to be countries. It can be any actors in international relations that are supranational elements. So that's the second big potential of the region, and that is to descend into chaos and bloodshed very quickly. And I would not really disregard the potential for trouble either in Bosnia and Herzegovina, with Dodik openly declaring he wants independence for Republika Srpska, or potential shifts in the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue and upsetting the situation in Kosovo, at least the north of Kosovo. I do have more hope for Kosovo, though, because NATO is there, and NATO is a pretty good responder when it comes to security and taking things down, both in terms of physical violence, but also in forging the dialogue that will lead to finding solutions. But I am concerned about Montenegro, especially lately. You see a lot of hybrid influence in Montenegro from Russia, from Serbia. We had seen attempts before Montenegro joined NATO to provoke a coup d'etat that would bring down the government that was pro-NATO. And looking into the future, my intention is not to offend anybody in Montenegro, but it's not impossible to imagine that Montenegro could be the first country that would ask for a referendum on leaving NATO. Now, of course, it's an issue whether that referendum would be successful or not. But I am concerned and vigilant about the processes in my neighborhood.
Where do you see the blockage, though, in terms of bringing these countries, which are theoretically candidate nations, into the EU, though? Is the balance more with the countries themselves who are not doing all the things they need to do to make this happen? Or do you think there is an element of thinking within the EU of looking at that region a bit nervously and thinking seriously, why buy trouble?
It's a bit of both, but I think that it's mostly the EU, the fatigue that developed after the so-called fifth enlargement wave, the Big Bang, when a number of countries in transition joined the European Union. And at the time, it was definitely a political decision. So there was a lot of discussion whether all the countries and all the sectors were ready to join the European Union. And then, Euroscepticism started to develop, fatigue with enlargement fatigue, etc. So Croatia, we kind of caught that last train. And I remember how difficult it was because I was the one to open accession negotiations. And when we were writing our positions, we consulted the Commission at the time and we said, do you think it's realistic? It was 2005 for us to say that we would complete negotiations sometime in 2007 and hope for a membership in 2009. And at the time, of course, nobody will tell you anything officially, but unofficially we were told, yeah, it's a realistic possibility. If you look, for example, at Slovakia, their accession process after the initial blockage and initial stalling, it really picked up very quickly. But, we know how things went. So Croatia joined on the 1st of July, 2013. But nevertheless, it was within, I think, a very reasonable framework. However, that was producing a lot of Euroscepticism. We were losing what we popularly call hearts and minds of the people because people felt like, okay, we do all of these reforms, we do whatever you ask of us, and we're still not good enough for you. So I can understand that countries in the neighborhood feel the same. And it was actually the war in Ukraine, the aggression against Ukraine, that proved to be an accelerator that gave a boost to the EU enlargement process. Because when Ukraine was given candidature to start negotiations on EU accession, then, you could not ignore Bosnia and Herzegovina and other countries in the neighborhood any longer. So we had to start giving those countries more incentives to do so. And I think that the parties, those not so benevolent forces who want to slow down the progress of the region, have then started to provoke the kind of problems that would put that process at a halt again. If you look at the relationship between Croatia and Montenegro today, you see Russian and Serbian influence exploiting the sensitivities of part of the population of Montenegro, again, because of NATO intervention at the time, and trying to stir these populist feelings that will literally create obstacles for Montenegro to move forward. If you create bilateral issues with Croatia, with one of the members, then, you're bound to slow the process down because it becomes difficult for Croatia to argue for Montenegro's membership, even though that is in the best of our interest. So this is how these parties are exploiting through hybrid action populist feelings and populist forces in order to push for an anti-European and anti-democratic agenda.
It's hard for those outside forces, though, to stir up those populist impulses or, I guess, find an audience for their disinformation if there isn't an audience for it. Is it your contention that this is just a fact of life in this part of the world that will just always have to be managed by politicians? You don't perceive a time when, if we think of the area of the former Yugoslavia, might get past all of this stuff? I know this is a part of the world from my own reporting where it's perfectly possible to meet people who will talk about the Battle of Kosovo Polje like it was something that happened last week rather than 600 years ago. But do you see, I guess, perhaps within the European Union, the region being able to put that kind of thing behind it?
I think we still have to put in a lot more effort in countering disinformation and investing more into public diplomacy to address both the benefits of EU accession, but also to address the skeptics on both sides. In the European Union, those who are skeptical towards further enlargement, to explain that the benefits have been not just for the countries who have acceded, but for the European Union as a whole. And to address the skeptics in the region of what would really happen, because there are mostly manipulations about losing sovereignty and, having another boss somewhere, not in Belgrade any longer, but in Brussels, etc. And you are absolutely right. History dominates the region. There are very few regions in the world where history is so strong that it overtakes not just the present, but the future as well. You mentioned the Battle of Kosovo, World War II. I mean, we're still fighting battles from World War II, unfortunately, in my own country, in Croatia as well. And especially when I look from the sidelines, when I travel and come back to Croatia, I am absolutely stunned by the level of political discourse focusing on some symbolism from World War II. And that continues to be a contentious issue in the whole region that is being exploited, much like in Ukraine, where this whole element of fighting not just NATO expansion, but fighting Nazism and ideologies like that became one of the excuses for aggression against Ukraine. Now, that sentiment is played over and over in the former Yugoslavia. As you know, all of our countries had, well, most of them, had some type of fascist, Nazi-aligned regimes. But they also had a huge number of people, Croatia, for instance, a much larger number of people fought on the side of the resistance movement. My own family, they were all anti-fascist and anti-Nazi. They were part of the resistance movement, but they were also anti-communist. And after Yugoslavia turned out to be a communist country, they all felt duped, to use a colloquial term. And it never could work because it was based on the suppression of freedom of identity, of freedom of speech, of freedom of choice, etc. So it was just another experiment in a long history. But then that history really, again, burdens the present and becomes a defining moment of the processes.
That was Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, former president of Croatia. And that's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Christy O'Grady. Christy also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. Special thanks to Roger Hilton, Henrietta Koneva, Alexandra Belova, and all the team at Globsec for their help with this episode. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Chris at cc@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.
"2024 is a defining year for global politics as more people head to the polls than ever before. How will shifts in power impact you? The Financial Times provides fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists provide impartial analysis of the economy, politics, and business, so you can join the dots and see the full picture. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.